Welcome, everyone. Climate Governance Malaysia is very pleased to present this webinar series on a very important topic, carbon pricing. This series was jointly curated with Andrei, a prominent figure in the field of climate change and energy policy, as the founder and executive director of the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition, which is a leading think tank that focuses on analyzing and advancing the implementation of relevant policies, particularly within the European Union. In particular, exactly 3 months ago, they issued a report on the state of the EU emissions trading schemes, which we would be very interested to hear more about. Carbon pricing is considered critical today for several reasons. It's an economically efficient, market-based approach to reduce emissions and very likely generate revenue for the government, which, if allocated judicially, could aid in a smooth and just transition. So all in, it is important to note that the design and implementation of carbon pricing policies need to be carefully considered to ensure their effectiveness and fairness, including addressing potential impacts on vulnerable populations, preventing carbon leakage, and ensuring a just transition for the affected industries and communities. I want to keep my opening remarks simple so that we can listen to the three really important thought leaders that we have in the virtual room today. In the meantime, let me hand you over to your moderator for today, Dr. Gary Theseira of the CGM Council. Over to you, Gary.
Thank you so much, Sunita. I'm assuming that you can hear me.
Yes.
Thank you very much. All right, so once again, a very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are very, very privileged to have with us this evening three esteemed speakers in this area, and they will each be given anywhere between 10 and 15 minutes to make their presentations. Andrei Marcu has already been introduced by Datin Sunita. As she mentioned, he is the founder and executive director of the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition, ERCST, and he will be presenting, making the first presentation this evening. It's morning for him, unfortunately, the results of the 2023 State of the EU ETS report. So, Andrei Marcu, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me today, and it's a great honor and pleasure to join again this series. We hope to contribute to the understanding of these tools and the importance that they carry currently in certain areas of the globe, and we assume that they will continue to expand. And pleasure to be here with Julia and Philippe. I will now make this new attempt, hopefully successful, in sharing the screen. I hope that this works well. It seems to be working. Now, what I wanted, so I've tried to modulate my presentation to cover a whole bunch of things in the 15 minutes that I have, but I would just very quickly, I think you have introduced an emission trading system, a cap and trade system, which is a regulatory market. It's a very simple instrument. There's a fixed cap, and that cap is, let's say, 100 million or 1 billion tons, and there's 1 billion allowances on the market that have a value of a ton each. The installations or the factories that are being covered by this emission trading system, this cap and trade, can emit whatever they wish to emit, as long as they can return to the regulator at the end of the year the number of allowances equal to the number of tons they have emitted. And the trick is getting your hands on these allowances. These allowances can come into the possession of a obligated entity, either by buying them at auction from the state, from the regulator, or there is the potential that some of them are being allocated free of charge because the state made the decision that some of it will be allocated free of charge to avoid carbon leakage, or they can be bought from others that have a surplus in the market. So there's a number of ways they can access these things. So the concept is simple. The cap decreases, the number of allowances it decreases, which makes us us to meet an environmental objective. Now, I will go very quickly through this. The first compliance market that we had was really the Kyoto market, the Kyoto Protocol market. And in this Kyoto Protocol market, we had the separation of the Kyoto Protocol of Annex 1 countries, the developed countries, and the non-Annex 1 countries, the developing countries. The developed countries had a number of had caps, a reduction related to 1990 emissions, and they were given a number of assigned amount units, allowances that they could emit, and they could trade among each other under Article 17 of the Paris Agreement. The developing countries could participate into this as producing offsets, and this offset could be bought and used to meet this obligation by the developed countries, which really had in the end the impact of increasing the cap because you introduce new allowances, new credits under the cap. Now, needless to say, this has been a mixed bag of success. The crediting system, the clean development mechanism has been in our mind a game changer because it has shown the value of markets to and the value of reducing carbon. But the trading among countries under Article 17 has not been very successful because there were a limited number of buyers and sellers. There were a number of buyers in the Western European countries, and there were a number of limited number of sellers, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, which had excesses because their economy had kind of declined as a result of the change from the Soviet system to the market system. And shows the importance of a market and the liquidity that you have to have in a market in order for this to function. The second market that what you can imagine as a cap and trade system was the EU market, and the EU decided to create an emission trading system that was covering about 40% of its carbon dioxide emissions. This was not plan A for the EU. The plan A was to have a carbon tax because of the structure of the EU. They could not do a tax because you had to have unanimity. So they introduced what they saw as the best thing was an emission trading system covering about 15,000 installations in a number of sectors: power, steel, cement, paper, chemicals. So a number of energy intensive systems. The main problem was that was to be addressed by the ETS was the fact that you needed to meet the environmental objective, but there was always a concern about carbon leakage, the fact that you had the carbon price in Europe, and how did you deal with that impact on competitiveness, and whether people that were subject or companies that were subject to carbon pricing in Europe will decide that this was not what they wanted to do, they could not compete, and they would move to other jurisdiction where there was not a carbon price or a lower carbon price. Now, so that's kind of where we are, and this was addressed in different ways as the time went by. Now, we see an evolution of the carbon markets at the global level and the EU level, because the EU, maybe with the exception of the Republic of Korea, Quebec, and California, really the EU is the dominant cap and trade market in the world. It has been for the last 20 years. It still is. They're not the only ones, but certainly they are the defining, and in my mind, the defining market for the moment. Now, at the global level, what we have seen is we had the initial Kyoto market, and this initial Kyoto market was very much regulated by the UN. There was one regulator. There were commodities issued by the UN regulator. So the market was relatively simple to understand, simple to follow, but really wasn't finished business. Then the reason it wasn't finished business is because only the countries that were OECD countries, Annex 1 countries, developed countries had caps. The other one didn't have caps. As the order of the emissions in the world and the economic power change, led to a change in that, to a very decentralized system. What we have now under the Paris Agreement, while the carbon market under the Kyoto Protocol was a very Cartesian, very easy to understand, a classical cap and trade system. The one under the Paris Agreement is very decentralized. There are a number of commodities or a number of currencies issued by each country. And the whole thing is really a lot more complex and is unfinished business. The Article 6 rule book has been put into place, but there's still a fair bit of work until you have a functioning market. In the EU ETS, and this is where I want to say there's also an evolution, because we started with the EU ETS with a limited number of sectors and with certain provisions, especially when it relates to how you dealt with competitiveness, because they were giving free allocation based on benchmarks to those companies that were exposed, energy intensive, trade exposed industries. Now, what we have seen is a change from that to from free allocation to introduction of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And this is another way of dealing with the issue of competitive carbon leakage as a result of competitiveness. This is what it is. People may dress it in many ways, but this is really what it is. The other important thing is that we have is the fact that the emission trading system has given a signal, together with the subsidies that were given to renewable energy, to the decarbonization of the power sector. So what we see in here is it is now the verified emissions in terms of industrial sector and the combustion of fuels. And we see that the combustion of fuels really has gone down quite dramatically for the number of years. We see the industrial sector having reached a much less strong decarbonization. They have been given free allocation for many years. And as such, the process is just now changing from the focus on power to the focus on industry. I'm not quite sure why it's doing this, but it's doing it. Now, the other thing the other thing that I wanted to show you, which is really the important part, is that the absolute emissions is one thing. The absolute emission are clearly also a function of the amount of industrial production. But the intensity in selected industry sector is what is really representative. And if you look at the emission intensity, this is from our State of the ETS report, which we issue annually, we see that we have quite a few sectors that have shown a little bit of decarbonization. It is a steady but slow decrease, except the glass sector, which seems to have gone in a much stronger trajectory than the other ones. The one thing that is also important to look is at the price fluctuation in the EU. Now, why is this happening? And this is something to be learned, because the design of the ETS in Europe was done, if you want, as with the thinking of an environmentalist in mind. And really, people did not see in the EU ETS the fact that supply and demand still ruled, in the sense that the demand for emission permits was very much a function of the industrial emissions on the industrial production and the intensity of production. So we see that the power sector has decarbonized and is continuing to do so. The industrial sector has been much slower to do so. They're very objective and not unreasonable reasons for that. But what we see is that what has not been anticipated was that the demand would drop dramatically, but the supply would continue to be on command performance, meaning that the supply of allowances to the market came through an auctioning schedule that the regulator put in place for 10 years ahead of time. So that continued unabated no matter what was happening around us. And at the same time, we also had an influx of foreign credits. So all these kind of led to a situation that you see price kind of lingering, especially after the financial crisis that was 2008, 9, 10, 11. So went down, down, down. At some point, what happened is that a surplus of about 2 billion allowances was accumulated in the market, and that surplus was then eliminated by introducing a flexibility in the supply. So the supply ceased to be rigid and on schedule, but there was something called the market stability reserve, which is a mechanism to take credits off the market when there's too much liquidity in the market. So the importance of a good market functioning cannot be minimized. So we do see an increase in a number of changes in evolution, an increase in sectors, a reform of some of the architecture, recognizing the fact that you have to maintain and mimic the flexibility on both the demand and supply side. Initially, I repeat, the supply side of the market, what the regulator put in the market was rigid, and as such created an enormous surplus. And what is also very important is if you want, addressing the issue of carbon leakage, which for many years was done through free allocation to the energy intensive trade exposed industries based on certain benchmarks. And as the cap decreased, it became less and less of the free allocation available to be made for these energy intensive trade exposed industries. And the EU has switched now to the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is all the rage in discussion in energy, in trade and climate change discussions. And we have had discussions with many people in the region, whether it's Thailand or Malaysia or Indonesia or India, about this effect that CBAM will have on your industry and on the exports. But this is, if you want, the evolution and what the current state of the ETS is, where it really had now changed for being something that was at a low level of warfare, meaning that the price was 10, 15 euros, which amounted for a small tax, if you want, that people could cope with, to prices that now have reached about 100 euros a ton. And that is really now impacting not only the power sector, which is well in the way to decarbonization, but also is clearly impacting the steel and aluminum and other industrial sector that now are beginning to have to make very serious efforts between now and the mid-30s to decarbonize. I will stop here because I didn't look at my watch, but this is what my presentation is, and I'll be happy to continue to provide answers to any questions that you may have. Over to you, Gary.
Thank you very much, Andrei. Well, I'm sure that there are some questions that will follow from your presentation. What we'll probably end up doing is monitoring the questions, the Q&A. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. We will curate them, and later on at the end of the presentations, all the three presentations, we will deal with all of these questions and answers. So once again, to the panel, to the participants, please feel free to begin adding your questions to the Q&A. So we'll move on to Ms. Julian Michalak. She's the EU Policy Director of the International Emissions Trading Association, otherwise known as IETA, IETA. And she will talk about how organizations can promote the establishment of functional global frameworks for trading in greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So with that, over to you, Julia.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gary, and thank you for invitation to join this panel. I got it relatively late, just last week, as I'm replacing, I understand, someone who was unable to join, so I still hope that my presentation will meet the expectation. Let me first start my slides. Just to check whether you can all see it. I guess you can see the slides now?
Yes, we can.
Perfect, thank you. I will very briefly start with introducing IETA, as not everyone might be familiar with International Emissions Trading Association, which I represent. We are a non-profit business association with over 300 companies being our members. You can see their logos on the right side of this slide. They operate in multiple sectors of carbon market compliance, voluntary carbon markets, and they are compliance entities, verifiers, credit providers, banks, project developers, exchanges, and so on. And we are a leading voice on business on carbon markets globally, as we have offices in all major jurisdictions where we oversight carbon trading policies. We also watch developments on the VCM and on the UNFCCC discussion about mostly, of course, Article 6 implementation. So if you have any further questions, you can look at our website or contact me. But that's who we are, and that's what we are following as IETA. And I would like to start with what has been touched upon into the movie that launched this series, this webinar, but having that maybe with structured visually. So the key differences between compliance and voluntary carbon markets, something that I understand this series largely about. Let's go through this table, which clearly visualizes what are those differences that make this market so different, but both, of course, relevant. And later on, we can move on how we see the evolution of the voluntary market towards the direction of a compliance market setup. And afterwards, I'd like to talk about the EU a little bit more, although Andrei said a lot already and provided so many interesting information about what's happening with regard to the EU ETS. So when it comes to a scope, of course, compliance markets, it depends on jurisdiction. It depends on the regulation that is put in place by national or regional laws. While in the voluntary market, this is a global market, and that covers any type of emission reduction or carbon removal activity projects. The purpose of the compliance market is to meet mandatory emission reduction targets and that are enshrined in the legislation or driven by regulators, while for the voluntary market, it is usually to achieve corporate social responsibility and sustainability goals, but also consumer demand. This market is not linked to mandatory emission reduction targets, so there are no penalties, and many other features of a compliance market are missing. When it comes to quality of credits, generally in compliance markets, there are more strengthened and uniform criteria for eligibility if use of offset credits is allowed in a compliance market, and that's not the case, for instance, for the EU, that has been already said by Andrei, and that I will also later on mention. Though in the voluntary market, the quality varies. It depends on the type of project location and what verification standard is used. Now we go to instrument for emission reductions. This is something that has been also mentioned. So the terms we are using. Usually for compliance markets, we talk about allowances. Those are created by central authority and either auctioned or allocated to market participants. While for voluntary market, we usually talk about carbon credits, which are generated by projects. The impact of the first one is to focus on meeting emission reduction targets, while for the voluntary market, there is a lot of attention also given to co-benefits. So biodiversity, co-benefits for local communities, advancing sustainable development goals, and they also may serve as a blueprint for the introduction of a compliance market later on in the future. When it comes to a type of units used at both markets, for the compliance one, these are verified reductions of 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent, while for voluntary, it's a permit to emit 1 ton of CO2 or CO2 equivalent. So these are project-based emission reduction credits. And when it comes to supply or demand drivers, when it comes to compliance market, the supply is determined by demand coming from covered sectors, and the number of allowances are set to correspond the emission reduction cap that puts a total cap on emissions allowed in a given market sector jurisdiction. On the voluntary market, these are project developers that projects originate offset credits. So the demand might be increasing from private sector for credits that will be then generated in bigger quantities. Examples, as also mentioned already, for the compliance market, EU ETS, China ETS, California, REDI, and different regional and national mechanism. For voluntary, here we have Verra verified carbon units, climate reserve, tons, etc. Instruments, I think I already mentioned that, allowances for compliance and carbon credits for voluntary. And the last column is water policy. So what we see on a compliance market, sorry, that's the other way around. It's for the EU is around 90 euro currently. The price earlier this year reached almost 100 euro, while for the voluntary market, it is depending very much on the project. But I understand that we talk about the range of about from 50 cents to $25 per ton. So in IETA's view, the voluntary carbon market is setting the way towards the establishment of compliance markets. This is to learn, this is to put in place a certain infrastructure and to get market participants accustomed with the concept of carbon trading. But as an end goal, we would see a compliance markets being put in place in all the jurisdictions and countries to meet their NDCs, those that are planning to decrease their costs and would like to make use of linking and transactions allowed by having the global carbon trading as an end goal. At the moment, VCM is about 2% of total carbon market value. So we see there is a big difference in how much is being covered by compliance market when it comes to global carbon trading and how much is just voluntary. And when it comes to Asian region, compliance markets are also on the rise here. We see that when it comes to VCM, there are diverse approaches, but there is a steep learning curve for countries in the Asian region to learn from this experience. And we see, of course, increased interest and strong support for Article 6.2 implementation in this region. But eventually, as I said, for us, the compliance market is the end goal that guarantees the environmental outcome and allows to optimize costs to reduce emissions for countries and jurisdictions. And we already have some good examples of compliance markets being put in place, being considered in the Asian region. So we have Chinese ETS, we have discussion in Indonesia about ETS for power sector. We have a plan by India to develop its domestic carbon market. And I used here ICAP slide that presents very clearly the global state of play when it comes to ETS developments. So in blue, those are systems that are currently in force, under development, dark green, and then light green under consideration. So you can see well that there are different stages of where Asian countries stand when it comes to putting in place their markets. In Malaysia, Malaysia is here marked as under consideration, but you can also see that other countries are in different stages. I will now move to a short summary of the key features of the EU ETS. As said, Andrei already said a lot about environmental performance and mitigation delivery when it comes to EU's emissions trading system. But I would hopefully complete what he already said in his opening presentation. So the EU ETS, as said, is the largest ETS on the world, multi-country, covers 27 member states, multi-sector, and launched in 2005. It sets a cap on emissions that is converted into EUs, and these are units used on the market, and one EUA gives the right to emit 1 ton of CO2 equivalent. There are a couple of gases covered by the ETS, so it's not just CO2. And there are more than 11,000 power stations and industrial plants. Maritime and aviation activities covered by the ETS. When it comes to industrial plants, this is production of, for example, iron, steel, cement, paper, ceramics, glass, chemical, oil, and others. There is a single union registry since 2012, before we had national registries by 27 EU member states. And the ETS is the main tool to achieve the EU's climate target of 55 net emission cuts by 2030, below 1990 level, and then climate neutrality by 2050. It operates in 27 EU member states, plus 3 countries like Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway. But it's also linked from 1 January 2020 to the Swiss ETS. So there is a full fungibility with units at the Swiss market, which are CHUs. No international offset credits are eligible for compliance. It was said that the experience of the EU with a large over allocation, largely due to import of international credits, led EU decision makers to the decision to meet its climate targets domestically. Auctioning is the default method of distributing allowances, but there is also a free allocation to industrial sectors. This will be gradually replaced by the introduction of the CBAM, and still in a few lower income member states, there is a free allocation of allowances to power producers. Penalties for non-compliance are €100 per ton. I figured out that it should be about 504 MYR, so Malaysian currency, adjusted with the EU inflation rate, plus allowances for non-compliance must also be bought on top of the penalty. There is an annual compliance cycle, so first there's an obligation to submit an emissions report at the end of March, followed by the obligation to surrender EUs by the end of April. The EU ETS contains a market stability reserve, which is an automatic supply adjustment mechanism. It is volume triggered. So if the total number of allowances in circulation goes above a certain threshold, then a market stability reserve absorbs a number of allowances, so to ensure that there is a market balance and a scarcity in the system maintained. We'll also have ETS2. It has just been decided by EU policymakers after a few years of intensive negotiations that among many other changes that were agreed under the recent review, that will have the ETS2 will be operating from 2027, covering road transport, buildings, and some additional industrial sectors. And together, EU ETS and ETS2 will cover about 76% of EU's emission. So we'll have emissions trading in covering 2/3 of EU's emissions just in a couple of years. Though the ETS2 has some specific features, and perhaps the most interesting is that the MSR, so the market stability reserve for the ETS2, will be both treated by volume but also by price. So if there is a price of allowances, if ETS2 maintain above 45 euros per ton for 2 consecutive months, there will be a release of allowances from the MSR. So it's interesting that it's a sort of hybrid system being put in place, and bridging, kind of paving the way perhaps to ETS1, and kind of bridging the establishment of ETS2 with some changes that will probably likely follow in next years. Also, as you can see, I included a price graph that illustrates that the change, very profound increase in carbon price in the EU that we observed within the last years. It also affects, of course, auction revenues that member states are collecting, as most revenues is being delivered directly to member states. some go to dedicated funds, and right now there is a proposal that some will be going to the EU budget. But I just wanted to mention the figure that for years 2023, 2030, the total auctioning revenues from both EU ETS and ETS2 are projected to reach almost as much as 400 billion euro. So that's a relevant figure, and it is also a new requirement that all this money should be used for climate action. I'll stop here. Thank you for the presentation. Happy to respond to questions if there are any.
Thank you, Julia. Apparently, I can't start my video because the host has stopped it. That's the message I'm getting. But as long as you can hear me, that's fine. Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate that, Julia. Not just going into the key features of mandatory markets and how we can differentiate them from the voluntary markets, but also very useful information on some of the refinements, I might call them, to the market structures that assist in keeping stability. On to our next speaker, Philippe Chauveua, head of the climate strategy for Solvay. Solvay is a global leader in materials, chemicals, and solutions. They deal in planes, cars, batteries, smart medical devices, water and air treatment, and many more areas. Philippe, we're very fortunate to have him speak on some examples from the ASEAN region, how having these systems can help corporations to prepare their own transition to low carbon operations. So with that, happy to give Philippe the floor.
Thank you, Gary, and good afternoon for everyone in the audience. I'm very honored to be able to share with you some feedback from an industry standpoint, participating into those markets, particularly compliance markets, since 2015. So 2005, sorry for that. As you said, we're a global company operating in specialty chemicals and performance materials. What company was founded 160 years ago, exactly this year. We're operating in more than 60 countries, and Asia is about 1/3 of our turnover. Now, focusing on emissions and where we are, and then I will stop with figures. Our scope 1 and 2 emissions, so basic emissions from our plants, are globally around 10 million tons of CO2 equivalent in 2022. The majority being in Europe. That's a legacy of a history, because we started our operation in Europe, so we have a strong industrial base there. We are participating in different compliance markets, in the EU ETS, in the UK ETS, in the Korean ETS, in the Chinese ETS, because we have plants in each of them. And we're also participating into the Californian ETS. Here it's an indirect participation because we don't have plants in California, but we have some offset credits which are used in the California ETS. So we participate through different angles, and that's where we are today. Now let me start with our end goal as a company. We've announced that we aim at achieving carbon neutral operations, so basically zero scope 1 and 2 by 2040 for all our businesses but one, and by 2050 for the remaining business, which is a soda ash business. The reason for the extra decade being that it has some hard to abate emissions. So this specific case means we need a bit more time to make it happen, or actually more time to make it happen. At the same time as we announced, and this is an important point to keep, at the same time as we announced our goals, we also announced how much capital investments we are planning to achieve these goals by 2040. And we said it would be around 2 billion euro totally by 2040, one for all businesses but one, and one for the soda ash, 1 billion for soda ash. That's what we communicated. So very sizable investments. We've set also on our trajectory to this end goal, a roadmap, a milestone by 2030 to reduce emissions 31%, which got approved by the Science Based Target Initiative. And at this juncture, as I speak, we are at a 15% reduction since our base year, which is 2018. So achievement in 4 years, almost 4% per annum, which is a result to enjoy. Now, coming to carbon pricing and compliance market, we see that as a tool for an end. The end of course, when Europe or China or Korea establish a compliance market, their target, the target of the country is to achieve neutrality by 2050 or by 2060 for China, to achieve what Julia has been commenting upon, or Andrei has been commenting upon, 55% reduction by 2030 for Europe. But we see that also as a tool for our own carbon neutrality ambition as a company. Now, how does it work, and what is our feedback on that? First, having a price incentive through a compliance market creates a financial value, a direct financial value. It's very simple to understand for our finance directors, if I smile a little bit on that, and our business directors, a financial value for reducing emissions. And it encourages allocation of capital to low carbon investments. This point of allocation of capital to low carbon investments is really the heart of the game. And of course, we've seen an acceleration since the price escalated in the EU from sub 20 euro towards 100 euro where it is today. Yeah? And you've seen on the charts that it happened starting 2018. Now, what are the results of that? So I'll give you three examples. We have a large plant producing soda ash in Germany, in Rheinberg. We've announced that we will switch the 2 coal boilers that we have there to biomass firing boilers. The first one is already invested and operational. The second one is in construction. The result is a reduction of 500,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. That's the environmental delivery. The business delivery is that it will help us also become the benchmark of the soda ash industry because of the renewable energy that is now that will be forming the base of the production of this product, and that's quite an achievement. And of course, there is a financial delivery, and that's why we don't communicate investment figures, but you can imagine what it can be, the order of magnitude when you're talking of 2 large-size coal boilers switching to biomass. A second example, quite similar, is another soda ash plant where we're switching, in that case, from coal firing to firing refuse-derived fuels. The reason being that we could not find sufficient streams of supply of biomass to make it biomass-based, and we couldn't find sufficient supply of refuse-derived fuels. Now, the result here again is cutting the emissions of the plant on energy production by 50%, which is a very strong improvement. This investment is made in partnership with a third-party company called Veolia, which you might know because they operate in Malaysia too. A third example is another plant which is based in France, in this case, near Lyon, near the city of Lyon, which is today running on gas. And by 2026, it will be running on biomass. Here again, we have a partnership with Veolia to make it happen. I'm using that final example to say that this plant combining both the switch to biomass firing and to the use of renewable energy, is on its way to become a fully carbon neutral, our first fully carbon neutral large size plants by around 2026. Way earlier than the 2040 target we have globally. So that's a couple of examples of what it means, and I can tell you that it actually here the price of the compliance market helps, is absolutely key to encourage the allocation of the massive capital that's needed to make those changes. Let me continue with the challenge that comes with a price, which we see from as an industrial. It's about the impact it has on costs, on competitiveness and level playing. The first response in the that you can see in the in the European ETS to that is actually having created a market that is covering the whole of Europe, not a country basis, but 27 countries, and even linking with a couple extra countries, as Julia has highlighted. So here it means that you basically take off the board the issue of competitiveness between these countries. Remains the issue of competitiveness with the rest of the world, which so far the EU has managed through an allocation of free compliance credits, free EUAs, based on benchmarks and declining over time because progress needs to be there. The EU is also testing now to about to start addressing this issue with what is called CBAM, for carbon border adjustment mechanism for a couple of industrial sectors. It's not a solution that is fit for every sector, especially the chemical sector, which I of course I know well, because of its exports and because its value chains are very intricate, so it can't fit. But this is a point worth having in mind. The competitiveness is something that can be managed in an ETS that needs to be managed for efficient effective consequences on the industries. Two last remarks. The first one, market versus tax, a market approach versus a tax approach. Now, let me share with you that on this standpoint, we are 100% with a market approach as a company for two flexibilities reason. The first one, we can with a market-based approach, we can mutualize at group level between different countries. We can make progress here, more progress here, less there, and manage it as a consolidated figure. The second thing, and that's managing the price, is it opens the possibility to hedge, so to manage price consequences, which the tax does not afford to do, and this is something that companies are used to do. We are used to manage prices of gas, prices of commodities, prices of this and that. Managing price of carbon is exactly the same, and this is something that can be done with markets only. So that's how we see definitely market as being superior, much superior in terms of effectiveness of another instrument. Final point, Julia highlighted that around 400 billion euro of ETS revenues will be collected until 2030. The loop back to innovation by recycling these ETS revenues is an important feature in bringing new low carbon technologies to demonstration stage, right, and to scale up. It's something that supports, for instance, the emergence of carbon capture and storage or carbon capture and utilization in Europe. So helping new technologies to go large scale, and it might help As an example, specific to Solvay, the new process that we have on which we're working, which we have announced, which will be basically a revolution of the soda ash process. We call it soda ash 2.0, slashing emissions by about 50% again. So I'll stop here, but this point on innovation is an important feature also associated to the compliance markets. With that said, Gary, back to you.
Thank you very much, Philippe. And so we've had 3 excellent presentations. I think we could have listened longer if there were more information to be delivered, but we did want to try to save enough time for the Q&A and maximize that time. So I'll get right into it. We have Kalanithi asking, since CBAM is an evolution of ETS, is the price there also 90 euros per ton of CO2? And I'm not sure who she's directing this to, but I assume that it might be Julia.
I think I cannot start my video, but hopefully you can hear me. Happy to respond to that question.
Yes, we can hear you.
The price of CBAM certificates will be reflecting the average weekly price of US at auctions. So, so the price of CBAM certificates will be basically similar to price of the US.
Okay, thank you so much. Also, another quick question. I think Anil is asking why voluntary market 95 euros, but the compliance market USD 25.
That's of course the other way around. I will correct it for the presentation. That will be.
Okay, right. Okay. We've got a question also. Well, while I have you on the line, the ICAP slide that you presented was a very interesting one on the ETS. Net map, are all of those compliance trading schemes?
Those in blue are compliance trading schemes that are in force.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now we have a question here from anonymous attendee. Given the price per ton carbon, the EUA has stagnated close to Euro 100 in recent years. Well, we can look at the data on that. Is there a mechanism to disincentivize players from just paying off the penalty of the same price in the case that the MSR reserves are too low or at worst empty? So in other words, I think this is a question about the punitive value versus the price and how perhaps the EU is treating this as if the price does approach the level of the fines, I guess, for non-compliance.
I understand well. There is a concern that if the prices are lower than the fine, there might be this incentive to comply. Though, just to clarify, that this 100 euro penalty is applicable on top of what has to be paid for on top of the purchase of allowances that must be done to cover emissions. So it's kind of both. So emission allowances bought, and then on top of that, the penalty must be paid.
So you must make good on any outstanding emissions before you are levied the penalty as well. Okay, thank you very much.
Maybe I can
please
bring in another side, because there's one point about actually meeting the compliance obligation. If you don't meet it, indeed you have a 100 euro penalty, and you still need to give 1 EUA, so it's you still have 100 to pay on top of it. Now the second thing probably is worth sharing with the audience today, again as a feedback. In parallel to the compliance price, we have set for ourselves, for the Solvay company, an internal carbon price, which serves in our investment decisions globally. So also where we don't have a compliance market obligations, okay? and it applies on all our scope 1 and 2 emissions worldwide. So here we've set a price at the level of €100, not because it is the EUA price, not because it's a European market price, but because basically this is a level at which technologies which are needed for very, very large reductions come into play. Particularly CCS prices, and I'm referring here to the studies of the IEA, International Energy Agency. They see basically around €100. So depending on cases, it can be less in some cases more, but around €100, the level at which CCS comes into play. And we know CCS is I would say, an expensive animal to reduce emissions. So before you reach there, you have a variety of options to reduce emissions. And that is probably the best response I can give to the answer. It actually, and to the questions on the reserves are too low, that at €100, you start to have sizable reductions that apply across Europe. It's still an issue because you need to make capital allocations, and we all know in businesses that capital is a scarce resource, so you have to manage cash availability and priorities, but that's basically the main driver and the main means through which reductions take place. Now, it doesn't mean that everything will happen at 100, because some technologies will be needed higher levels to be implemented, but that's why we really start to see more reductions coming from the industry. We know that the cuts here are usually more expensive than in the electricity sector. So that's why you saw on the slide presented by Andrei a start of an acceleration of reductions in the industry.
Thank you, Philippe. Anything that you wish to add, Andrei?
No, I think the question has been well answered.
All right.
Let's
okay.
move on.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for dealing with those questions. I do have a question. Yeah.
If I may very briefly, just wanted to add one thing that I thought might be interesting.
Sure.
That in general, there is a very high compliance rate in the EU ETS. I think it's about 97% that we, for the last year, that we saw a compliance rate, so only 3%. And I think there are many airlines that had an issue with compliance. So it means that the system is working and the penalties are, I think, deterring from a non-compliance. And overall, there is quite I mean, it's very good result, of course, for the EU ETS that proves that the system's solid.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it was Philippe who mentioned that they've got some operations with the China ETS, and I think also possibly, Julia, you mentioned something about some of the Asian emissions trading schemes. Some of the lessons that were learned from some of these actually indicate that in some situations you might just have companies simply buying just enough credits to make up for what they need for compliance without necessarily investing in the kinds of technologies. In other words, in a market where sort of everyone wants to sandbag and rely on the availability of credits, particularly in a situation if credits are allowed in from the outside. So apart from actually banning the use of outside credits, which you actually talked about in one of your situations, what other methods might there be to ensure that not only are corporations simply abiding by the thresholds by buying credits, but actually moving in the direction that in the same market they actually begin creating credits rather than simply everyone waiting for everyone else to create them? Any thoughts on that?
Well, listen, we would not be favorable to anybody forcing anybody. In the end, We still hope we live in a market economy, and if we have senior management and boards of directors, they have a certain responsibility. They're not a bunch of kids. They are elected there because, and they're put in that place and paid good money because they have to have a responsibility to make corporate decision, rational economic decision in the interest of the corporation. So if it is their decision whether to comply or over comply. It's a strategy that they have responsibility, with fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders to act in a way that is responsible for the current and future welfare of the companies. If we look at what happened in the SO2 market in the US, which this is all comes from, because in the end, this is the precursor of this market. There were different strategies. There was a massive amount of switch to low sulfur coal from Western states in the US before people could put in scrubbers. So the decision in the end, I think either we decide to let the market rule, or we start intervening with the loss of efficiency. In the end, the reason why we have a market is because it's presumably the most discover the most efficient way of decarbonizing. The moment you start intervening in markets and putting different, if you have tax code provisions to do this and move it in that direction and the other direction, which is what is happening and in the real world, you do lose that efficiency. It is a deterioration in the efficiency of the market. The question is, at which point the politicians or the pressure groups temptation to interfere in the markets crosses over and begins to deteriorate the market efficiency, that the market is not worth anymore. If indeed then you know what you have to do, then just regulate it and get it over with. So there is a crossover point, and this is an art. This is the art of the regulators and the art. For instance, from our point of view, the EU has relied very much on regulation of the market. It is trying to regulate the market via rule-based system. Well, markets are usually functioning in a very, very rapid way. And we personally think that something that is a lot more flexible, that can respond as opposed to the speed of what the regulators can respond, is a more appropriate way. But these are different circumstances in different countries, the EU system, for instance, of regulation and legislation is a very, very long and inflexible one. Takes 2-3 years at the minimum, probably in some cases. The market would have moved way, way in different directions. So I think that it really depends the governance of the design of the emission trading system, the governance of the jurisdiction in which you are. But in principle, you should allow the market to make the decision, and those responsible for those that have fiduciary responsibility to discharge those responsibilities. I understand we are dealing with a lot of corporate directors on this call, so I assume this is music to their ears.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Andrei. I noticed that this also dovetails a little bit with what Philippe was talking about when he was saying that he much preferred the markets to a tax, because their ability to handle variability and to hedge as well. Do you want to add anything, Philippe?
Well, I think I expressed it already. We are generally, for emissions which are concentrated at the point of emissions. That's basically what happened with the power industry and with the with industrials, large size industrials. This is obviously much more favorable to manage a market than to manage a tax. We've been constantly getting that. And the reality, when you question the 11,000 installations that are covered by the ETS, you have a super large majority which is, no, please keep the ETS over any other instrument system. The response is overwhelming. We know how to manage that. Okay, so that's probably the best answer in short. Now markets require size to be effective. The EU offers it, China will offer it by itself. Korea works, but it's probably as a market, but it shows also the limitations when you go, or the specific challenges when you go to smaller scale. So if we speak about Malaysia going forward, as itself, probably it will have some challenges on its own as a market. But if it can manage some linking with neighboring countries, then the issue of size is certainly manageable much more easily. And the size is needed when we speak about markets, because you need you need liquidity, you need trades to happen, sellers and buyers to happen. Otherwise, you don't have a market. You have a bazaar maybe, but you don't have a real lively market.
Yeah,
Andrei, you wanted to add a word on that?
Andrei, please.
Yeah, the example that, if you want to wait, there's a couple of very simple examples. Is that there was a NOx market in Ontario, and it was in Ontario, Canada. It was, my recollection was Ontario Hydro and Ontario Hydro. So they had a limited number of installation, never really went anywhere. The same thing was in the Kyoto market under what's called Article 17, trading between countries. Annex 1 countries, developed countries. There was a limited number of countries, very limited number of sellers, very limited number of buyers. There was no liquidity. Basically, you have, I don't know, one country from Western Europe being in a room and then talking to 5 other countries from Eastern Europe to buy allowances, and that was about the size of the market. So it never really became fluid. The price discovery was very poor, and unless in the end the market. What does the market do? The market allows you to do price discovery and allows you to hedge risk. That's about all what the market does. It doesn't do anything else. So unless you have a good functioning, then you better to look at other instruments that are more appropriate for the jurisdiction. This is why I was very much aligned with what Philippe said in the case of Malaysia. It is, you have certain sectors that are quite energy intensive and emitting, and they're probably quite active, but it's limited. So I think that looking at Southeast Asia as a bubble in some way with other countries in the region is probably something that politically, whether it's feasible or not, is something that the politician in Malaysia and other countries will know better.
Speaking of, yeah, so Julia, do you have anything you want to add to this present discussion on scale? Because I think it's quite relevant.
Maybe just to throw another example of the UK, which is an interesting one, as the UK was a part of the EU, and after Brexit, it has left the European Union and also decided to left the EU ETS, obviously, and set up its own carbon trading system in place. So it's a UK ETS, which covers around 1,000 installations. So it's more than 10 times less than what the EU ETS covers. And initially there were many doubts whether this system is going to be liquid enough and provide features and a kind of architecture for those covered under the system to buy, sell, trade freely and deliver emission reductions. This is a small system, much probably still bigger than what would have been in Malaysia if there is a cap and trade in place, but it is working. The prices are very similar to those in EU ETS, and there are right now some further reforms ongoing to ensure that this system will deliver on the UK 2050 climate targets. So at the moment, the UK does not really see a political appetite to link with the EU ETS, though we believe that it would be the right direction to go for this system. But it is an interesting experiment to watch much less liquid, a much smaller market, operating on its own without any linkages so far.
Yeah, thank you. So all of these provide the contrasting examples of some situations where we might work. Of course, we have all the studies that came out of the China example when they had their 7 different markets, which covered quite a few sectors. But then when they finally decided they wanted to go national, they decided to go only with the energy sector. We have some questions here, a number from Anil Mungad. First of all, we invested 120 million last year in new steam turbine generator. I think that's STG, to convert internal steam to power, 10 megawatts. How do we get carbon credits? We're manufacturers of petrochemicals, PX to PTA. I'm not sure what those are. I'm sure that some of you might know. We are investing 20 million in an NGR recycling plant for internal generated polyester waste into recycled chips, which will be used in manufacturing of fabric. So once again, the question is, how do you convert these into carbon credits? Particularly when there's no compliance market around. Would anyone be interested in taking these questions?
I think the only way, I mean, that you can monetize this, and I don't know the details of the project. I think that there's a lot is in the details, but probably the only way to look at it now, if you look at compliant market, is try and look under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, in Article 6.4 or 6.2, try to monetize this, but that implies obviously cooperation from, I assume this is Malaysia, from the government of Malaysia, cooperation with another buying government, whoever that may be. So there is a process that needs to be put in place in order to be able to monetize, create international transfer mitigation outcomes that can be sold to other countries. And it's a matter of also not only putting them through the regulatory machine, but also to find a customer that is willing to pay. As I said, the market that was created under Kyoto, what is called the carbon market 1.0 under the Kyoto Protocol, was much more commoditized. It was, such credits were issued by the CDM Executive Board, and once they issued them, presumably they had a stamp of approval, etc., etc. Under this, you can either issue under the Paris Agreement, you can either issue it under Article 6.4, which is still in the construction phase, or under Article 6.2, which is similarly under the construction phase. But that is the regulatory, unless there's a national compliance scheme, that is kind of the avenue that could be pursued at this point. It's not encouraging that it's taking so long, but the Paris Agreement from a market, from many points of view, is a very good agreement. From a market point of view, it's a very complex agreement. And really has made things more, we've been negotiating this for a long time now. We hope to finish it.
Would anyone else like to weigh in on this? Yes, Philippe.
Well, this is touching on the voluntary carbon markets that Julia commented upon, and as she highlighted, if I remember well, the numbers is more like compliance markets that make 98%, and voluntary markets make 2% of the value. I think it was in value, which means that there is so far a voluntary demand is still emerging for a number of reasons. The first one is probably that there is so far a limited recognition of value in offering low carbon products. Okay. Ultimately, we see an emerging trend there, and that is part of our drive to reduce our own emissions. On top of what I said on top or in parallel to what I said on the compliance markets, we see some emerging demand from customers because they have their own corporate targets or they want to offer their own low carbon products. So it's here, but credits, offset credits, as suggested here by Anil Mundad, are not so far recognized in corporate accounting, which is regulated basically by the GHG protocol. And what this means is that it's being asked companies, broadly speaking, to reduce emissions in-house first and at scale before turning to external compensation through credits. So this is part of the story, and the second part of the story is that there is a little, not enough yet, recognition from customers, from end users, and so from brand owners and from our own clients in offering low carbon products. This is growing, but not yet at the scale that would require massive offsets. That's one point. The second point, because it's a voluntary market, it's unregulated, and there are a multiplicity of schemes, some with high integrity, some, and when I'm talking integrity, I should say environmental integrity, some with super high, some with less high, and that makes it very difficult for companies, buyers and sellers, to navigate its way and find the right markets. Also, it makes a very, I would say, fragmented market or fragmented markets. And here again, we turn to the size of scale, liquidity. So going into the offset market is still, let's say, in its infancy. Although it's been in infancy for quite a few years. There's hope going forward. But it's probably not a good solution for everything. It's a solution for some projects, but probably not every project. And indeed, when Article 6.4 picks up, as Andrei said, or Article 6.2, that will create a change in speed.
Yeah, thank you so much, Philippe. Anything to add, Julia, before I move sort of into some closing sections?
No, I think I don't have anything to add.
Okay, so it does look like there are a number of decisions that the country, Malaysia, the region, the stakeholders here have to make. Both the political leadership, the civil service, etc. The type of instrument, whether it is a tax as the path has been taken by Singapore, whether, as some have indicated already, there are voluntary markets already in this region. Perhaps I would like to go through the panelists one at a time and put this question to you. Given the size of Malaysia's economy, the scale of our emissions, the level of technology, and similarities and differences, given your experience with countries in this region, whether you're coming at it from a regulator standpoint, or in the case of Philippe, from the business standpoint, how would you navigate this transition from a situation where many markets already have a semi-mature voluntary markets, indeed might even have forward purchases or forward contracts for either purchasing of voluntary credits or even generation of voluntary credits, some of which might actually, through the loss of additionality, become non-credits because they now fall into a compliance system. What advice would you give for some initial steps? What are some key pieces of the puzzle that need to be in place that you would consider necessary for both the private sector and the government to move forward, both nationally and as an ASEAN region? May I begin with you, Andrei?
Well, look, giving advice to government, it's always fraught with risk. But I would say, I think the typical thing that people do is to, and I don't know the situation in Malaysia, but my chagrin, the one company that I know it's quite knowledgeable about is Petronas, but I don't know about the rest of the industry. But I would say that the first thing you want to make sure that you have your monitoring, reporting, and verification system in place. I think that's a fundamental thing that you do have to have it in place. I would also explore the participation, at least incipient participation in the international markets, to, if you want, give the sense of value for money, of carbon reduction. But on the third step, I would also enter into discussion with with ASEAN countries in terms of the possibility of moving in tandem, because the one thing that you don't want is you don't want to necessarily compete with on different qualities of compliance mechanism or if you want the quality of credits. I think this is something you want to compete on other things, but not on that, because it gives a bad reputation to the country, to the region, and in the end it doesn't help. But that's kind of the way I would move at this stage. I think that again there are certain countries in the region that have been part of the partnership for marketing readiness, market implementation. They're not all I know Singapore has been quite active. IETA is quite active in Singapore. So I think there is not a quite the same level, I think, in all countries. The different countries will have different level. Singapore, Malaysia, I think you have a certain fairly sophisticated governance in terms of financial regulation. So I think that you'd have to look at all these things at this time.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrei. On to you, Julia.
I think that it is important that rules that are put in place are clear and predictable, and that you mitigate from the beginning the risk of changing these rules frequently, stages of having regulations being put in place. I don't have much expertise in the Asian region, but I understand from my colleagues who gave me a brief update about Malaysia that there is a 2050 carbon neutrality target set by the Malaysian government, and that emissions actually were increasing very rapidly in recent decades. So there is definitely an end goal that Malaysia wants to reach, and there is a clear problem to tackle. And having cap on emissions, a total cap of emissions, is probably necessary to reach the 2050 target. So cap and trade might be a natural solution here. Indeed, as said, cooperation with other countries in the region may be beneficial to ensure that market is liquid and delivers best possible price discovery. But also I would mention one more element, which is building the trust of stakeholders and involving them in the dialogue from the very beginning.
Okay. Thank you so much, Julia. And what about you, Philippe?
Well, I'll bounce back on some. First, I subscribe to what Julia and Andrei have shared. Now that's obvious. Indeed, there's one thing from a company standpoint. When the country in which you're operating has a carbon neutrality target 2050, it basically transfers to your own operations. So it creates an obligation by 2050. Hopefully there are some interim milestones, which is what Europe, Korea, UK, China have been doing, having some stringent milestones, more or less stringent, but increasingly stringent milestones. And that creates a need for a tool to achieve those milestones and the long-term goals. And it starts there. Now, it serves also the change that we are seeing happening gradually in the industry. I say there is not yet enough demand for low carbon solutions, but it's picking up. It's picking up because it's emerging in some places, it's growing in some places, and companies then turns to its own suppliers, wherever they're in the world, to say, I want some products with lower carbon footprint. That's what we call Scope 3, yeah? You're familiar with that. And this is driving the agenda of companies. This is driving the business agenda of companies. So Malaysia or the rest of the ASEAN countries are not in isolation from this trend. It will progressively transfer to them. They need tools to enable that, both their customers' agenda, meet their customers' agenda, and the agenda of the countries in which they operate. Now, obviously, a compliance market is a superior tool. That's what I explained from our standpoint, from our experience. And there is a question on size. MRV is indeed the first step. It's all where it started. And in the initial steps, so remember what's happened in Europe or in other countries, it starts with low prices. It's just starting like when you want to do biking, you start with small wheels on the side, and then progressively you get better, and you can accelerate, and you can do up hills. So that's that. There is a learning curve. It needs to start, and it needs to start now, because 2050 is about one time of an investment cycle in the industry. So if it's not starting now, 2050 will be very hard to meet.
Yes.
I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Philippe. With that, just some closing thoughts. I suppose we might want to consider, even as we begin engaging with our ASEAN partners, to start talking about the kinds of mechanisms that we implement, maybe a common understanding of what net zero by 2050 actually means, perhaps what it means for sectors, etc., and then start thinking about perhaps should we begin putting a prototype mechanism together, but at the same time incorporating all the adjustment mechanisms, the stability mechanisms, and any safeguard mechanisms. And if we can agree on those, surely that will help us to move forward more quickly than otherwise. But it just remains for me to thank very much all you three, Andrei, Marcu, also Julia Michalak, and Philippe Chauveua, I hope I get that correct, for the very, very enlightening, very informative sessions this evening. And as you know, this is only the second. We have another session tomorrow and a fourth sometime in the future. Do register and attend those as well. Thank you very, very much for tuning in. Appreciation to Saras for her support in the background. And if any closing notes, I'd like to hand it back to Datin Sri Sunita, if she's still here.
I'm still here. Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate this. As you know, the recording is going to be available, the blog post, and any slides will be shared. Thank you so much to all our esteemed speakers today, Andrei, Julian, Philippe. We really, really appreciate your time. Looking forward to meeting up with you again soon. Thank you.